engage in this conversation, because it's a little bit of a heavy thing to talk about, but you guys are soldiering through it, and we're so grateful for that. So yeah, my name is Ashley. I'm the vice president of the Red Cord. I've been fighting human trafficking now formally for, I guess, going on 5 years. And I jokingly say I didn't look for human trafficking, it found me. And it's something that I'm committed to fighting for as long as I can. We all have different strengths, and this seems to be something that God has blessed me with the skills to work in. So a bit about the Red Cord real quickly, and then I'll let Jacquetta introduce herself. The Red Cord, we were incorporated in 2014 or 2015, excuse me. We are Southwest Oklahoma's only anti-human trafficking organization. Our main goal as an organization is education. Because one of the things when we started this organization is we realized there's a lot of people at the other end of the pipeline that are rescuing the individuals, the victims, after they've gone through trafficking. But there's not a lot of people upstream that. And so that's a huge mission with the Red Cord, is we want to prevent this, but also give people the resources and the confidence to deal with this should they go through it, or they know someone that's going through it, or they see it, or anything of that nature. So the Red Cord, we have 4 pillars: awareness, education, support, and prayer, because we are a faith-based organization. But the awareness, education, pretty self-explanatory. The support, we like to partner with other agencies that are in this realm, and this could be homeless shelters, child welfare service providers, law enforcement, you name it. If you're in the fight, we're going to link arms with you, basically, because this is a compound problem that requires a compound solution. So we are just one piece of the massive puzzle, but we are full of a lot of volunteers who are just as committed as myself and Jacquetta. So it definitely gives us hope for sure when we look at this. So Jacquetta, you can introduce yourself however long you want, and then you can go ahead, I guess, and share your screen.
Okay, well, it won't take very long, but Ashley is, I like to say, my niece by choice. I've known her since she was a very young girl, and I know her heart, and she knows my heart for children too. And so she invited me to start participating with the Red Cord a few years ago, maybe 2 or 3. And for a while I was very active doing trainings. The last year I've not been as active, just because I've been involved in other things. So in 2018, I went to volunteer for CASA, Court Appointed Special Advocates. Some of you have probably dealt with CASAs with your foster children. And it was my niche. It was exactly where I needed to be. I had foster care has been on my heart for many, many years. My husband and I applied to be foster parents back in the 80s or the late 70s. At that time, they wouldn't let you adopt out of foster care. In fact, the wisdom of that time was, do not let children attach, because the goal was to return them soon to their parents. And they thought that it would be, it would not be a good thing to let them attach to foster parents. So we backed out of that, but it returned over the years. And so to me, CASA was kind of my do-over to invest in foster children. And then a year later, after 2018, I was invited on staff, and now I'm a supervisor for District 3. So that's Jackson County, Tillman County is what I supervise for advocates for. And so both of these things are interlinked. They're dear to my heart. And so, and as Jennifer said, I just took my first placement on Wednesday night. And it has been I have much support for you guys who've been doing it for years, or much admiration for all of you who've been doing this for years. And I'm taking names and I'm taking email addresses, and I'm going to be calling you. So it's been a ride. It's been a real ride the last few days. I have just a lot of respect for you. And so with that, I'll get started, and then we'll have a time for questions at the end, or comments. I'd love to hear your comments. So let me share my screen.
While they get set up, to remind everyone again, post your name and your email address in the chat box at some point before the end of the evening, so I can get you your training credits.
Okay. So, we've already said what we're here for. We actually believe that you are on the front lines. And so it is wonderful for us to be able to talk to people who have the ability to catch things at the very beginning. You want to take over here, Ashley?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a policy, we always issue a trigger warning before we do these presentations, because we want to be mindful that we don't know everyone's experiences that are in our audience. I've had everyone from victims to survivors to buyers to traffickers in my audience. So we want to be mindful of that. So if at any point the stuff that we're going to go over, if you feel like it's causing you to feel extremely uncomfortable or bringing up triggering thoughts, self-care is important. It's very important. So take some time, step away from the screen if you need to. But I would definitely encourage you to come back, because we've got a lot of really good information, and we try and be, mindful of keeping it non-triggering to a degree. So, but yeah, so we like to open up with that. Jacquetta, you want to do next? There we go. So we're going to show you guys a quick video here. It's going to kind of be a synopsis of what we're going to be going over for this next hour or so. But yeah, so it's very impactful, full of a lot of really good information, and we just want to open with that.
I was a former foster youth. I also experienced the juvenile justice system, and through both the systems, I was exposed to child sex trafficking. And just seeing the cycle of criminalization, I decided that I wanted to advocate for this issue for girls who, at this point, remain voiceless.
What we have found is that foster children are particularly vulnerable to this. And there are many, many reasons for that. Many foster children do not have strong ties with their families or communities because of family dysfunction and from having been moved around from family to family and throughout the community.
And then they become so numb to this process of being put on the street and getting arrested and being put back on the street and getting arrested. And that's all they know. And a lot of times pimps want them to get arrested or want them to end up in a foster care or whatever the case, because they have the ability to recruit when they do that.
These traffickers are very smart, they're very street savvy, and they understand how the system works. They know that the kids in foster care are more vulnerable. They know that they're looking for someone to love them. As a result of this, they very actively target kids who are in foster care or kids who are out on the streets alone. And when I realized that threatening them with these sort of punishments was just not effective, I realized that I needed to find another way to engage them and help them. So now, after developing this program, I work with very well-trained and very, very dedicated attorneys and advocates and probation officers. And I get a sense from the girls how they're doing, whether or not they're going to be graduating from high school, whether or not they need help getting a dress for the prom, or any other assistance that a teenage kid might need. What is important is building a relationship with them, and we do that by being consistent with them, by responding when they ask for questions, by being there, and by seeing them much more often than most of the players in the system usually do.
There have been a lot of things taking place on a county level, on a city level, on a state level, especially within California, where our legislatures and our officials are starting to notice that child sex trafficking is a huge problem that's been ignored for way too long. And they are putting systems in place to make sure that police officers are trained, social workers are trained, teachers are trained, and foster care parents are trained. And so what I want to see happening, and what I feel is starting to happening, but just not on a large enough scale, is that there's intervention and that these girls are being rescued and they're not put back in the same environments.
From my perspective, the most important factor in helping foster kids to not fall into this trap is to educate them early, to let them know that there are people out there who may approach them and offer them many things, but not necessarily be good for them. They need to understand that. And they need to have choices. They need to have adults and mentors who are meaningful to them, so that they aren't as likely to want the attention of some stranger.
These girls can aspire to be anything they want, and they need to see that they can grow up and be lawyers and doctors and politicians and teachers. And they're not going to see that unless we show them that this is important, that they're important, and that they matter, and that regardless of what they've been through, they can still grow up and be anything that they want to. So they need to see that, we need to show them that, and they need to know that there is life beyond sexual exploitation.
Well, I'm working on it. It's not wanting to let me switch to the next slide. So guess maybe it's going to make me go clear to the end. Nope, there. Okay, there we are. Okay, why are Ashley and I here? Because 60% of child sex trafficking victims have histories in the child welfare system. Foster homes or group homes. We don't need to tell you, although we're going to go over it, why they're more vulnerable. Some of it you already know. But anyway, children in the welfare system are at least 4 times more likely to experience sexual boot camp or sexual abuse, boot camp for sex trafficking. 95% of teen survivors were victims of prior sexual abuse, either by family or close acquaintances. This is a quote from the Child Welfare Information Gateway. Due to their potentially unstable living situations, physical distance from friends and family, traumatic experiences, and emotional vulnerability, children involved with child welfare are at risk for being targeted by traffickers who are actively seeking children to exploit. And I know that Ashley can tell you more about that.
Yeah, so she's already mentioned twice 2 key terms, or one key term is vulnerability. So traffickers, we need to understand, traffickers are looking to exploit vulnerable populations. And so children, just by virtue of being children, they are vulnerable. So add on top of that any kind of trauma, whether that be physical abuse, sexual trauma, the family structures torn apart, homelessness, poverty, all of those things are making a potential victim more and more of a, for lack of a better word, a catch for a trafficker to use, because we're going to talk about it in a few more slides, but traffickers are very calculated, and unfortunately they're quite methodical and smart with how they target and how they profile and how they approach their victims.
Okay, runaway. A child who has run away from foster care will be contacted by a trafficker within 48 hours. Traffickers know where to find vulnerable children. They know where runaways hang out. They know both what to promise them and what to threaten them with. In August of 2013, the Oklahoma Department of Human Services announced that 78 children in custody of Child Protective Services were missing, and 38 of those children had been missing for more than 3 months. That's out of an article in the Oklahoman. So we don't need to be blind to the fact that that's still going on. There are still children missing. I know I've experienced with my work with CASA and talked to directors and to caseworkers, and they tell me that when a teenager runs away from foster care, they do not move heaven and earth to find that teenager, because they know they're trying to get back to their family and that they eventually will. and it takes resources that they don't have to look for those children. And so they're particularly, if you have teenage foster children in your care, just know that they are particularly vulnerable.
So how big is this problem? So we get this often when we start talking about human trafficking. People say, well, it doesn't happen here, right? It's not happening in my city or my town. It's not happening in Oklahoma. That's just a big city problem. And that's partly true. It is a big city problem, but it is also a rural problem. It's every state problem, unfortunately, because human trafficking is the fastest growing crime in the world. So a few years ago, it was number 3. Number 2 was the illegal arms dealing, and number 1 was drugs. And it surpassed the illegal arms dealing a few years ago. And once it did that, they said, okay, well, it'll become the number 1 crime in the world, maybe in the far off future, right? Well, the far off future is now. As of 2020, human trafficking is rivaling drug trafficking as the number 1 crime in the world. So why is that? Why is human trafficking, why is that becoming more lucrative than the drug trade? And the sad reality is, if I have an ounce of cocaine, how many times can I sell that ounce of cocaine? I can sell it once. And then I have to go to my supplier, have to go through the whole chain to get my product. But with human trafficking, you could sell a 12-year-old how many times a day? Up to 50. That's what we've heard, up to 50 times a day. And you don't even have to leave the comfort of your own home. You can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't like with drugs, you can't see if someone's on it necessarily. So it's a low risk, high reward criminal enterprise that traffickers are now starting to either double dip or taking all their resources and putting into exploitation, sexual exploitation specifically. Conservatively, 100,000 plus children right now are being trafficked in the United States. Now, we're going to use words like approximately, conservatively, because human trafficking is a hidden crime. Oftentimes, victims and survivors refer to their exploitation time as being hidden in plain sight. One of the biggest issues that we've had is when people start talking about human trafficking, it's normally within the realm of misconceptions. So what do I mean by that? Well, when most people think of human trafficking, what do they think of? They think of kidnapping, the creepy guy in the white van, parks, that type of stuff. And while that's great that it's getting the conversation started, that's not what human trafficking is. Kidnapping is a completely separate crime. It only accounts for less than 5% of all trafficking. And why is that? Well, it's because the majority of trafficking is what we call familial trafficking. And this is what we see mostly in Oklahoma. And so that means it's mom trafficking or selling child, grandma selling child, spouse, brother, sister. That's what we see the most of, not the creepy guy at the park who's kidnapping kids. While that still may happen, just be aware that its relationship to human trafficking is not huge. But the FBI, as of like a couple of years ago, they said that they believe the number of children being trafficked right now in the US is closer to 250,000 to 300,000 that they know of. And so that's, again, this is a very underreported crime because it's within the family. Last year, human trafficking made $151 billion. So that's a large chunk of change, if you will. And I know when I first read that, I couldn't quite conceptualize how big that was. But if you were to take the profits of Nike, Starbucks, Adidas, whoever you want to take, combine them together, and they did not profit $151 billion last year. So to say that, there's a lot of money tied up into this is an understatement. It is a massive, massive enterprise. On average, a trafficker will make between $200,000 and $250,000 a year tax-free per victim. And the price actually goes up if the victim is a minor. So again, going back to why children are more vulnerable, it's because the market actually has a higher price value on their heads.
Okay. This is another quote I pulled from Child Welfare Information Gateway. A 2013 report by the HHS Administration on Children, Youth, and Families cited a number of alarming statistics, including several studies showing that 50 to more than 90% of children who were victims of child sex trafficking had been involved with child welfare services.
So the definition of human trafficking. So this is a federal statute. Oklahoma statute is pretty much worded the same, but we just use the federal because it's a little clearer and it's a little shorter. So the definition of sex trafficking is in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which a person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. So that's a lot of legal speak, but we'll break it down in layman's terms. So commercial sex act, by definition, that means that it is a sexual act that is being exchanged for something of value. So value could be money, but it could also be food, drugs, rent, clothing, shelter. It doesn't have to just be money. So something of value is being exchanged for a sexual act. If the person is 18 years old or older, you have to be able to prove force, fraud, or coercion in order for it to be categorized as adult sex trafficking. If they are under the age of 18, you do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion, though they will be there. But legally speaking, you don't have to prove that in a court of law because a child cannot consent to a commercial sex act. So anything of value, if anything of value is being exchanged for that child's sexual act, it is automatically seen in the eyes of the law as child sexual exploitation. One of the marked differences between adult sex trafficking and child sex trafficking is a trafficker. So for instance, in order for force, fraud, or coercion to occur for an adult, you more than likely have to have someone who is using those things, right? Inducing those things. So you're going to have a trafficker who is forcing them, defrauding them, coercing them into it. But with a child, all you have to have is a child and a buyer. So I'll give you an example. This took place in Texas. This was a 14-year-old girl who grew up in a very bad home, lower socioeconomic status, single parent. Her mom was addicted to drugs, very violent, abusive. So one day she ran away, ended up creating a relationship with an older gentleman, I shouldn't use gentleman, an older man. And it turned violent very quickly. But in the process, he got her hooked on meth, which is quite a common drug that we see with children in the sex trafficking world for other reasons that we won't go into. But she ended up running away from him, found herself on the street. She hadn't slept for like 3 days because she says she knew if she were to go to sleep, she would get raped. She knows how it works on the street. And so on the evening of the third day, she was walking on the street and a man pulled up next to her and began to ask her questions. What are you doing on the road? You look way too young. I've never seen you here before. Where's your mom? Where's your home? And this young girl coming off a 3-day binge of meth tells this man everything. Of course, she just breaks down and starts from the beginning of her life story to the end. And this guy empathizes with her. Oh, I feel so badly for you because I had a similar story growing up. I grew up in an abusive, household, and I was also in the, child welfare system and blah, blah, blah. Well, it's about to get dark and it's getting pretty cold. Would you like to come home with me? I've got, a nice home. I live by myself. There's food. You can hang there for a few days until you get back up on your feet. So she thought that was great, right? But he only asked for one thing in return, and it was a sexual act. A sexual favor is how he put it. So she thought about it and weighed her options, and she decided that would be the most prudent thing to do. So she provided the sexual act for him. He kept his word. She went to his house, stayed there, got food, got back on her feet, and went back on the street. Now, was that child sex trafficking? Yes, it was, because a commercial sex act took place. Was there a trafficker involved? No, there was not. It was just the victim and the buyer. So that, again, is the marked difference between a child and an adult. And that's something that people need to realize. When children are engaging what they call survival sex, that is child sex trafficking. According to law, there is no such thing as a child prostitute, because in order to be, by legal definition, a prostitute, that entails a willing engagement. A child cannot consent at all. So they're automatically seen that way. Labor trafficking, we're not going to go too much into, but force, fraud, and coercion has to be there for both sides, and that's their labor services. It's important to remember that a trafficking victim need not be transported for trafficking to occur. So this is just a bullet point of the most common type of trafficking that we see here in the United States and in Oklahoma. This is not an exhaustive list, but we're just going to touch pretty much on the first 2 or 3 as we go throughout this. So child sex trafficking, I just went over that in detail. Child pornography. Unfortunately, in the United States, we lead the world in the production and consumption of child pornography. A lot of sociologists are talking about how in the United States, we seem to be going towards what they're calling a pedophilic shift. It's very disturbing, extremely disturbing to know that, but that seems to be a reality for various reasons that we're going towards. But it's also important to remember that when we talk with young people, sexting is a huge thing. And sexting in the eyes of the law is the creation of child pornography. So if we have a young person who is taking pictures of themselves and sending it to their boyfriend or posting up online, the OnlyFans thing, for instance, a lot of minors are getting involved in that because they think it's a cool way to make fast money, right? They don't realize that they're also producing child pornography, which is, basically a huge issue. Commercial sex trafficking for an adult, that's the prostitution, escorting, stripping, pornography. All of those industries are riddled with that. Intimate partner trafficking. A lot of these children who've been sex trafficked talked about how they saw their mothers, or sometimes their fathers, but mostly their mothers, victims of sex trafficking themselves. But they just refer to their moms, oh yeah, she was a prostitute. But when we go back and look, we see that it was the boyfriend that was the trafficker, or was their dad that was the trafficker of the mother. Labor trafficking, involuntary domestic servitude, that's like house cleaning, street begging, illegal adoptions. Organ trafficking, another one that's not on there, but again, those are not quite as common. Possible process of trafficking. So this is just one template that is quite common. It's not the only one. These could be switched up, but this is what we mostly see. So the target is identified and befriended. This is the wooing stage. This can last anywhere from 6 months to a year. If they are not related to the child, they will do this online. They will do this over social media. Snapchat, Instagram, and TikTok are the 3 apps of choice for traffickers. And I tell that to parents and they're like, well, great. My children has all 3, of those. But yeah, traffickers are quite savvy with technology that's out there, and they know how to pretend to be a young person that they're not, or they know how to present themselves in such an alluring way that the child doesn't even care that they're an older person. Again, they're very sly. The second stage is going to be they're going to introduce or enhance drug and alcohol use. I have yet to meet a sex trafficking victim that did not at some point have a chemical dependency. And that's understandable because we're not created, how we are designed, we are not created to sleep with 20 to 50 people in one day at the age of 12, at the age of 10, at 16, at 24, at 37. It doesn't matter. That's not how the body is designed. So the trafficker is going to try to introduce things of that nature as soon as possible so they can already start to have a source of control, leverage on that individual. So they're going to create that friction with family and friends, the grooming stage, the gaining of trust, alienation from family, convincing them of an unbearable family life. Now, if the child already has an unbearable family life, the trafficker can just go ahead and skip right down to number 4, right? He doesn't have to go through creating friction in the family. But if the child comes from a good family, which we hear of, it's not unheard of, he's going to go through, or she's going to go through this whole process. The 4th is isolation from former friends, drawing them into a new family and friends. When we go into the lingo of human trafficking, which we're not going to go over tonight, we notice that it's all family oriented, family centered. So the trafficker is referred to as daddy, uncle, poppy, or if it's a female, mommy, mama, madame, something of a parent name of some sorts. The victims refer to one another as wifey-in-laws, cousin-in-laws, sisters, brothers. The whole operation is referred to as the family. And there's a reason for that. Traffickers talk about how they like to play psychological games with their victims, and this is part of the psychological game. If a child or if a victim has never had a family structure, well, this is your first family. If the child or victim has had a family structure, this is in a sense a return to normalcy. They'll have chores, they'll have, just normal things of life that they used to have in their past life that actually is giving them some, a sense of comfort. Even though that's not the case, they're not in a good situation environment at all. Desensitizing, that really starts at stage 1, but that's that changing of the moral compass. I know of one trafficker who specialized in victimizing pastors' kids. And he said his main thing was just to get them to slip up once and get evidence of that. And he said it was really, really easy to shame them and blackmail them into becoming future victims, because he said they had a high moral compass. So the moment that he could just mess that up just a little bit, they had so much shame and guilt that they were willing to do whatever to keep from suffering the consequences that he was threatening. And the final is going to be the taking of the victim by force, fraud, or coercion. Now, this taking doesn't necessarily have to be an actual physical taking. This is the mental taking away. 100%, and I said 100%, not 99, not 98, but 100% of young people who meet their trafficker online will go willingly to the first encounter with the trafficker. And why is that? It's because they think that online they can make a real life relationship with someone. And that is one of the unfortunate side effects of the social media age that we live in, is young people think, if I have talked to you on my social media, if I've seen your pictures and liked your pictures and FaceTimed you or whatever, I know you. Granted, it's only been 2 weeks or maybe 3 months or 6 months, but I know you. I'm confident that you're my friend. And that's something that we really try and talk with young people about. What is the true definition of a friend? What are some safety mechanisms that you can put in place to make sure that you're not being, falling prey to a template like this? And this is something that I encourage all parents to talk to kids about, is online safety. And just basically not being a soft target. Traffickers are going to look for young people, and Jacquetta, you can go to the next slide. Traffickers are going to look for young people who are not aware that the trafficker is there. They have zero predator detection mechanisms. We'll put it that way. So Jacquetta, you want to do this?
Sure.
This slide?
Sure, and I liked on this slide, what it reminds me of is when people either comment or ask, what is the difference? This is just prostitution, it's child prostitution. This is what I tell them the difference is trafficking involves force, fraud, or coercion. Now, as Ashley's already pointed out, no child can perform as a commercial sex act that is not trafficking. But even in the adult world, even in the adult pornography world, or in what we term prostitutions, many of those victims are victims. They are not enjoying having sexual relationships with 25 or 30 people a day. They are being kept there by force, fraud, or coercion. So force is easy to see. We've seen many instances of that. We know that if we see beating or slapping or burning or sexual assault, rape, gang rape, confinement, being locked in, or torture, we know that that is beyond the scope of what is acceptable. We know that's forced. But fraud and coercion are kind of more difficult to see. And we've heard or seen evidence of this happening many times in real life cases. So fraud might be someone contacts your foster child or your natural child online, and a lot of times they're watching for keywords in chat rooms or on these platforms, something like, I'm so bored, I hate my parents, I wish I were somewhere else, someone DM me, something like that, and they'll jump right in and they'll start really empathizing with, oh my goodness, I couldn't stand parents like that, I feel so bad for you, you're so beautiful, you should be a model, come here, I'll send you a ticket, you can come here, I know a producer. That would be some of the fraud that we would see. And coercion, threats of serious harm or restraint, that's not always to the victim. Often that might be threats of serious harm to the victim's little sister or little brother. Okay, you won't come here? Well, I know when your 5-year-old brother gets off the bus, I know, where your 4-year-old sister stays at daycare. And this is something, a person I personally know in the Lawton area, and she told me about her 14-year-old, and that her 14-year-old had begun receiving messages from somebody who seemed to know her through one of the social media platforms, and eventually started messaging her, telling her that he had naked pictures of her, 11 of them. And if she did not send him more nude pictures, then he would send these pictures to her mother. Well, thankfully, number one is she had a really good relationship with her mother. Number two, I guess number one should be she had not sent any naked pictures to anyone. And so she went to her mother, and the way, her father is a detective. And so she went to her mother and said, listen, I don't know who this is. This is what he's doing. And she said, well, call his bluff. Give him my number. Tell him to send him to me. And so she did. And she gave the number to the whoever was contacting her. And he said, oh, I see. You've got your mom's phone. So you're just going to delete them. And so her mother her mother had the girl take a picture of the mother holding the phone and saying, this is me. This is my phone. Send them. And so he said, okay, he would do it the next day, and he didn't. But about a week later, he did send 11 nude photos, headless nude photos. That's something that's rather new that's going on now with kids sexting. They think they can't be caught if their face is not shown. And so this girl had a similar body type and coloring. Thankfully, the mother didn't believe it. And eventually what was found is this was a classmate that had gone to school with this girl since she was very young. And he was doing it to many other girls in the community. And when the police went to his house, the grandmother, who he was in her custody, the grandmother just handed the detective her phone, or the child's phone, and said, I just took this away from him. And they found pictures of a relative who was disabled on the phone as well. So that would be coercion. So, and many other cases we could tell you about. Youth at greater risk because of lack of personal safety, isolation, emotional distress, homelessness, poverty, family dysfunction, substance abuse, mental illness. Just that left side of the list, doesn't that sound like most of our foster children? That occurs in their family many times. You could count 3 or 4 of those things in their families. Learning disabilities, developmental delay, childhood sexual abuse, sexual exploitation by family members or peers. And this is something that Ashley has already mentioned. It is a very sad reality that in this day and age, we do have mothers selling their daughters for rent. We do have fathers trafficking their children on the street or selling them for the pornography trade. And like she said, double dipping. It is double dipping. They win on both sides. They produce, first of all, they take sexual victims, they take trafficking victims, and they make the money off of them as long as they can, which, by the way, is about 7 years. That's the life expectancy of a trafficking victim, is about 7 years. And so they're making money off of exploiting them in that way, and then they're filming abuse or even the sexual, just quote, the sexual act itself, and they're selling that through the pornography industry. So lack of social support, and then in care of foster care system, and low self-esteem. Here's another quote from a victim. Being in foster care was the perfect training for commercial sexual exploitation. I was used to being moved without warning, without any say, not knowing where I was going or whether I was allowed to unpack my clothes. After years in foster care, I didn't think anyone would want to take me without getting paid. So when my pimp expected me to make money to support, quote, the family, it made sense to me. These behaviors, a lot of these indicators are something that are behavioral indicators that we would see in foster children anyway. So sometimes that makes it hard to distinguish whether this is typical behavior of a traumatized child, even just only traumatized by being in the system, or if it is trafficking. So it is something definitely to raise your antenna anyway. An inability to attend school regularly, unexplained absences, a decline in grades, or becoming an overachiever, coached or rehearsed responses to questions or inconsistencies in answers, an atypical change in possessions. That could be that they're coming home without possessions that they had, or more likely that suddenly they have possessions they cannot afford and you did not provide. A sudden change in behavior or relationships. Always on the phone with new boyfriend or girlfriend. A boyfriend or girlfriend who is noticeably older and or controlling. Frequently running away from home. Lack of control over personal schedule and identification. Often trafficking victims, one of the first things the trafficker will do is take their identification from them, and so they may be telling you they've lost it. Uncharacteristic promiscuity, terminology beyond their years. Withdrawn, depressed, fearful, and attempt to conceal scars, tattoos, or bruises. Of course, we know where the bruises or the scars might come from, but you might not know that often traffickers brand their victims. And so you might notice tattoos on friends they bring home. They might be what used to be called a tramp stamp on the lower back. They might be anywhere on the body. And often they might be something with a dollar sign in it or something with a name. It could be, Frank or whatever, but you notice they have the same tattoo as someone else. And so they do this branding. So pretty much it is, quote, their brand. If a customer likes the service he got from the girl with the flower with the dollar sign in the middle of it, then he might ask for that same brand again. Sleeplessness, headaches, stomach aches, anxiety. Signs of drug addiction, hunger, malnourished, inappropriate dress for weather. And as we've kind of, I think, maybe hit on a little bit, one of these indicators does not, raise a huge red flag. If you see 2 or 3 of them, you definitely need to be watching. Hyperarousal, symptoms of anger, panic, phobia, irritability, regressive clinging tantrums, impulsive, jumpy, difficulty sleeping, high gear, hypoarousal, symptoms of daydreaming. We would in the study that I've done, we would see this as maybe dissociation, inability to bond with others, inattention, forgetfulness, dissociating, fatigue, irritability, sadness, aches and pains.
So just to add on that, yes, I can, but just to add on the end of that, disassociation, a huge part of surviving sexual exploitation, or sex work in general. It's the fracturing of the self. So it's very common to see, and I know of survivors, even though they're out and they've been rescued, and thankfully these ones that I'm referring to, are on a good road to rehabilitation. One of the lasting impacts of trafficking is having multiple personalities. Because if you know anything about, just the basic generality of that illness, it's you're compartmentalized. You break off and you become someone else. And a lot of them refer to, they'll have 3, 4, one of them had up to 16. And each one of those personalities that she had came from a different trafficker, came from a different traumatic experience, came from a different personality that she had to personify when she was with different buyers. So that's something that we also see with young people. It's a survival mechanism. That's just how the brain works. That's how the brain's going to cope with what they're going through. So it can be frustrating to deal with someone who's going through that. But at the same time, if we understand that that's just a natural way that the brain is trying to keep that person alive, that might help a little bit with understanding them. So who is the trafficker? Who is the pimp? So we've already just basically said earlier, it's mostly a relative, but it could be anyone who is susceptible to greed, which unfortunately we all are. So if someone feels like they can sell a human being and get away with it, and if they've looked into it and realized that they can make $250,000 or more a year with no taxes attached, there is a good chance that they could be a good candidate to become a trafficker. And this is something that, you know, a lot of people say, well, just point out what the trafficker looks like, right? Just give us a painting of what he looks like, you know? And a lot of times they'll give us the idea of like, oh, he must drive a large Cadillac. He's got a hat with a feather in it. He's got gold grills. But that's not what we're seeing anymore. We're seeing it's the Fortune 500 CEO. Maybe it is the drug dealer, but it's also the pastor. It's the cop. It's the lawyer. It's the judge. It's anyone who's susceptible to greed. And we need to keep that in mind, because unfortunately we've got the wrong goggles on when we're looking for what the trafficker looks like. And because of that, we're letting a lot of traffickers go underneath our radar.
Okay, 9 factors have been identified that make foster children particularly vulnerable to trafficking. So let's go over a few of those. Placement in a foster home is inherently traumatizing, and we all know that. Just the fact that they have been removed from their parents' home, doesn't matter if it was a bad home, that it's what they are accustomed to. And so I'm experiencing that with my 2 foster placements right now, is a lot of trauma related to just being moved 3 hours away from their home, not having been able to see their parents yet, or one of their siblings. And so that is in itself is so traumatizing. I'm definitely seeing that firsthand now. And of course, they've lost ties to other people that are familiar to them, also their schools, their teachers, their friends. The friends is something that I really hadn't considered a lot previously, but these children are sad that they were taken from their friends suddenly and didn't even get the opportunity to tell their friends they were going somewhere. Okay, number 2, foster parents receive payment from the government. You guys know we're getting rich on this. My goodness, we're so rich. But that is the way the children see it. You know, I'm just a paycheck. So if I'm just a paycheck, I may as well get something out of it. So, and we've heard that from victims that they were just a paycheck anyway, and that they weren't really cared about. So why should they be with someone who cares about them, which is what the trafficker is saying. They know the buttons to push, the traffickers do. Frequent and sudden changes in placement become a routine of life for foster children. Oh, this just breaks my heart. That's why I do what I do, as a CASA supervisor, and why I am doing this right now. It breaks my heart. One of the foster children I recently did respite for named for me 9 different placements. He could remember he'd been there 2 hours or 2 days or 2 weeks or 2 months over the last 3 years. And he was able to tell me. That just broke my heart. Families are torn apart unnecessarily. Unfortunately, these are the statistics that 78% of children whose CPS or DHS in our area deemed victims in 2012 suffered, quote, only. I wish they'd put that in italics, because I know that's what they mean. They don't mean that neglect is harmless, but that it was without physical, sexual, or psychological abuse. And as we learned, I think probably in this training, my trainings are kind of meshing together now, but that even a 6-month-old a nonverbal child, or even just a child still in womb, is affected by abuse happening in the home, even if they're not involved directly. Many neglect cases are largely due to poverty, and instead of being split up, many of these families could have been better helped by family preservation services. These include training and budgeting and nutrition. I don't know what it's like in whatever county you serve in, but in the counties that I serve in right now, does seem to be a turning point where they seem to have realized that it would be better to put their resources, and of course the Family Preservation Act is in effect, and I know it's kind of being rolled out slowly, and some counties are able to not implement that right away. But anyway, we're seeing some new programs come out in our areas aimed at family preservation. Federal funding currently favors foster care, and of course, as I said, we've got some new acts out that has kind of are attempting to change that. More funding should be allotted, or is currently allotted for foster care than for family preservation services. You know, it's a slippery slope, isn't it? We don't want other way to happen too. Also, getting these children back into unsafe situations without what needs to be done before that happens. So, number 6, foster care homes can be abusive. We know this. It saddens us. I know it does. It does me. That these children who were already traumatized are sometimes re-traumatized by their foster families. This results in lower enforcement of foster home vetting standards and reduced foster home quality, as well as placement in group homes. All can harm the children. Number 7, traffickers know foster kids are vulnerable targets. As Ashley has already said, they're going to go for the most vulnerable targets, and who better than a foster child that nobody's really looking for, that can't easily slip through the system. Traffickers frequent places likely to be attended by foster kids: shelters, group homes, after-school programs. They know that they are more likely to be traumatized and susceptible to luring or wooing. There is a lack of adequate supervision many times, and a lack of awareness and training of supervising personnel with knowledge of how to combat targeted recruitment. Number 8, foster children frequently run away. It's just a unfortunate fact, and particularly the ones that anywhere from tweens to age out, they hate being where they are. They want to be back with family, or they are on their own, so they are particularly vulnerable. They can feel the streets offer more control than their foster care provides. There, a trafficker offering attention and care can easily pick them up. Once they run away, they are unlikely to receive follow-up investigation. Oh, I hated to hear that, but I've heard it straight from their mouths. Aging out of foster care can leave a foster child stranded. Once minors age out of foster care, they're likely to become homeless, be left without a significant family connection to return to for support. Ashley, I know you have some personal stories to add to that.
Yeah, so I can think of one individual that we spoke with, and she talked about, so as soon as she aged out of the foster care system, she didn't have any place to go. Unfortunately, there's sometimes, you guys probably know this, there's a little bit of miscommunication with what the services are for children who are aging out. And with her, this was the case. So she found herself from going from always being in state custody to dropped into adulthood. She had no skills, no connections, no social safety net. And so she was able to basically fall into the hands of a trafficker who presented himself as her boyfriend. And she talked about there were 2 places that traffickers came quickly to meet her at the door, like metaphysical door, I guess you could say. And she said it was when she aged out of the foster care system, but also when she would get out of jail, because as an adult, because she was going through what they called prostitution, she got picked up for drugs and other smaller things of that nature. And she talked about how traffickers were the only people that were there for her to go to. They are actively seeking these people out. And that, to me, when she was telling me that story, that kind of made me feel convicted, in the sense of, it's the wrong people that are hunting these vulnerable populations. And that's part of why the Red Court exists. We want to prevent that. So we are trying to circumvent traffickers and get to those vulnerable populations before they do. Give them the resources, give them the care, the attention, whatever that they're needing to keep them from thinking that a trafficker who is a wolf in sheep's clothing is the best option. So proactive steps for prevention. So be aware of the 9 factors that Jacquetta just went over. And consider that with each of your foster care children. What are the things that are going to make this individual more vulnerable? Each child's different. Some of them may be strong in a whole bunch of areas, but they are struggling with this or something of that nature. So, keep that understanding there. It's a fluid thing, but just keep that baseline that's there. So watch for indicators. There's a whole lot more indicators that we didn't go over just because of time's sake. But when we do this with educators, it's like 9 slides of indicators that we go through. And again, with those indicators, it's not just necessarily one, but when you start seeing multiple red flags, that's when you need to start doing a little bit more investigation. There's a saying that goes, if I can get it right here, I always mess it up the first time, but the eye cannot see what the mind does not know. So by having a point of reference or knowing what are the common indicators of trafficking, when you begin to subconsciously pick up on these red flags, hopefully that'll send off the warning signals of, now, wait a minute, this is starting to fit the template of a potential a trafficking situation. Know if before and after school programs are well supervised and by whom. That's a huge thing in our schools. Again, a lot of children are aggregated there. That's a great place to do recruiting. There was a trafficker up in Norman. He actually would enroll his girls into the school, and they would go and they would find, as recruiters, basically, they would go and find the most vulnerable kids in the school, befriend them, and then bring them to the trafficker. The shelters, the same thing at the shelters. Traffickers will send their victims in there and say, if you don't want to work, if you don't want to be abused, you need to bring me a replacement. And we see that happening often. That's definitely happened here in the Lawton Still area, which we're not going to go into all those cases. But regularly check in with your school personnel, counselors, teachers, and discuss any concerns. Who are they hanging out with? Are they present, for all the periods throughout the day? What are other kids talking about that your child, or, what's the school struggling with at the moment? Know your child's friends, also including their virtual friends. Closely monitor their online activity, social media. I know this is a rough one. This is very, very rough, especially if your child is, tween or a teenager, because that's a private thing, right? Because unfortunately, most of us have grown up in the millennial world with thinking social media is like our diary. So we don't want our parents to look at that, but that is a huge doorway. I like to use this as a visual. Basically, when we go to sleep at night, we lock our doors, right? I hope so. Why do we do that? Well, it's because we don't want to wake up one night and there's some guy standing over us saying, don't freak out, my name's Bob, I just want to talk to you, right? That's something we don't want. We don't want someone to come into our home unannounced, uninvited, that we don't want to be there, because we have no way of vetting what their intentions are. But let's think of it this way. How many of us lock our social media doors? Because our phones are just the same, if not more dangerous than our front doors. Anyone and everyone can come into our home via this doorway. And in a sense, this phone, our technology, it leads to not only into our homes, but into the thing that is the human being. How many times we've heard the stories about young people who have committed suicide just from online bullying, right? It's because there is that deep connection. So online social media monitoring as a parent is key and crucial, and do it in a I guess you could say a partnership way. If you start talking with your kids about what is out there, basically see it as an alliance of, we're trying to keep you safe and we want you to also be on guard to keep yourself safe. Personal responsibility is great. Continue to build child self-esteem and self-image. Engage in frank, age-appropriate conversations with the child about human trafficking. This also includes having the pornography talk, which, again, a lot of people hear that and they're like, oh my gosh, don't have that. But unfortunately, in the United States, the age of first exposure for pornography for a male is 8 years old. I can tell you right now, we have a school district in the 5th grade. They're having what they're calling a porn outbreak, because a boy found a video online, brought it to school, and now all of the kids in the class have been exposed to hardcore pornography, and they're in 5th grade. They're all confused, and there's a lot of issues going on now because of that. Pornography is a gateway drug into human trafficking. And we're not, again, we didn't touch on that this evening, but we have a whole presentation on that. In fact, in November, we devote all of our trainings to talking about the connection between pornography and trafficking. Jacquetta kind of alluded to that a little bit earlier, but that's something that needs to be talked to our young people, especially our boys as well, because when you get into it and you get into the nitty gritty of it, pornography and human trafficking are basically different sides of the same. Invite the Red Cord to come to your schools, churches, civic organizations, to train teachers and other adults. We are free. We're 501c3 organization. So this is what we do. No one gets paid for this, but it's because we have such a passion for spreading awareness and education on this topic. So Jacquetta, you can go to the next slide if you want. So what if I suspect? You want to do this one?
I was just going to say before you start that this is a slide that I developed along with April. So it goes along with Circle of Care's course of action.
You can do this one, Jacquetta.
Okay. Is the child in imminent danger? That's the first question you want to ask yourself. If they're in imminent danger, of course, call 911. Include language such as child sex trafficking when speaking with law enforcement. Report your concerns or suspicions to Circle of Care as well as DHS hotline. This will create a history which may be vital later. Also report to your DHS caseworker. We also recommend you call Oklahoma Human Trafficking Hotline, and here's the phone number. You can write this down, or I can definitely send this information along to Jennifer and she can disseminate it to you. You'll be asked a series of questions and directed regarding what next steps you could take. Or they could connect you to the appropriate authorities. They have connections throughout the state, which may include local law enforcement, human trafficking task force. Again, when speaking to law enforcement, it's important that you use language which includes child sex trafficking so that you will be funneled to the sex trafficking task force or the human trafficking task force. Do not try to rescue a potential victim. Now, this means that of course doesn't mean don't try to keep your child that you know is being lured home. That doesn't mean that. That would be rescuing also. But if you see a child being taken by a trafficker, don't try to step in, and it's very dangerous. The traffickers are serious. This is a huge money-making concern for them. They don't care if the victim lives through it or not, as long as they keep you from stopping their enterprise. Document everything you observe and hear, including actions, words, activities. If you're suspecting something's going on with your child, you're overhearing conversations, or even you're hearing something from other children or friends of theirs, take those notes. What activities are they doing? What names are they using? Have you seen any tattoos or scars or markings that could identify victims or a perpetrator? If you see them being taken in a car, it may not be even your child, it may be one of their friends. Note the car make, model, license number, their estimate of their height and weight, hair color, anything you would think might be helpful to the police to help pin them down, find where they are, and of course relay this information to 911.
So additional resources for local assistance with resources, you can always reach out to the AG's office. For instance, for assistance with resources on human trafficking, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, Polaris Project, Shared Hope International, Operation Underground Railroad, Fight the New Drug. If you're interested in learning more about pornography and the human trafficking connection, or just about the exploitation within pornography, that's a great resource. Is Fight the New Drug. For tips on suspicious activity, you can contact the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics. The Human Trafficking Task Force is actually located underneath the umbrella of the narcotics unit here, and they're great people, unbelievable individuals. And real quick, I'm going to plug these 2 books that are not on there, but I highly recommend this for everyone. This is called Sex Trafficking Prevention, and it's a trauma-informed approach for parents and professionals. It's a short book, less than 200 pages, excuse me. But it's amazing. This is an excellent book to get. If I could give this for free, I would. But it's written by Savannah Sanders. She actually is a survivor of child sexual exploitation. She was in the foster care system. Just an amazing, amazing book to basically go into. So Sex Trafficking Prevention by Savannah Sanders. You can get on Amazon for like $12 or something like that. And the next one I would recommend, and just disclaimer, it's a very disturbing book, but it's called The Pimp Game. If you are interested in learning what is going on in the mind of a pimp, that's another book that's a good one to have, because it basically just lays out what pimps are doing in order to recruit children. And it gives you kind of a good perspective of maybe what we should be doing in the positive way to keep children from falling prey to this. So you can go to the next slide, Jacquetta. So what you do with this information will understand how it impacts your child, be trained, be aware, and recognize the indicators of child sexual exploitation, and then follow the protocols regarding suspected child trafficking. The biggest issue that we see with reporting is not over-reporting, but it's under-reporting, because everyone's afraid to report this because they're like, well, I don't know if this is real or not. I don't know, maybe I'm just reading into this. But we need more people calling in with tips for sure when it comes to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. You can find the Red Cord on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. We're not on Snapchat. We will not be on Snapchat for multiple reasons. But you can reach out to us there. You can also contact us through our website, www.theredcord.org. So this is an older slide. We actually are not meeting at the Hilton. We stopped doing that last year just because of the whole COVID-19 things going on. So every second Sunday on our Facebook, we upload a new video at 6 p.m. of an interview that we do with professionals around the world. We've had everyone from people in Washington, D.C. to large international organizations. So there's some really good nuggets if you go check out our Facebook and look at those interviews that we've done. And so the last slide is going to be Oklahoma victim service providers. Oh, my screen just went down. Well, I'm just going to mention them by name. So in the state of Oklahoma, we only have 4 shelters for trafficking victims. You heard that right. For the entire state, we only have 4. And only one of those is for minors of sex trafficking victims. And that's RISE. Amazing organization. Great people that work there. We partner with them. We support their work. But they're located in the Muskogee area, and they only have about 9 beds, and they stay full year round. So that's something that I plug with people and say, you know, I love animals, but there's no reason we should have over 7,000 shelters for animals and 4 for human trafficking victims for our entire state. Dragonfly Home is another one, great resource to have if you're wanting to connect with another organization that's fighting human trafficking in Oklahoma. Amazing ladies that work there as well. So with that, that concludes our presentation. Thank you guys so much for sticking with us. I know that was a lot of information really quickly, like the fire hose was open, but hopefully you guys were able to glean some information from that. And if so, we've done our job, and we're very grateful again that you guys have spent an hour of your time with.
That was awesome. Does anyone have any questions? Please ask if you do. I learned things from that. I have a master's degree in what I thought was important things. So clearly I know nothing. No, just kidding. That was amazing. Nobody?
Well, it's because we answered all the questions. That's it.
Very obvious. It's good to know y'all do this without cost, because this might be a good resource to bring around again, or do something on one of the topics we couldn't divulge in anymore.
Is the court involved in the rehabilitation of child sex trafficking victims, or trafficking victims, like for kids who are in foster care? As far as
so we're not a victim service provider. So that's going to be RISE or the Dragonfly Home. It goes back to those 4 that are in the state of Oklahoma. Divas Call Rape, which is located in Tulsa. They also, as of I think last year, they're now accept some minors. It depends on what the situation is, the case is. And Day Spring or Day something Villa is the other one. I don't have my slide in front of me, but so the Red Cord, we are not a victim service provider, but we can help people get connected to victim service providers. We are primarily about prevention.
Okay, well, we are definitely done with the content part. So if anyone needs to jump off, you can. If you want to stick around and hope there's less people and have a question you want to ask, that's fine too. But I'll make sure your email is in the chat, and I will get you your training certification for the evening. I have a question. So I learned like what sex trafficking is and what it's not. Can you and this is whatever, I'll just be honest, it's fine. I definitely was not aware of how, I don't want to call it informal, but it I very much had the whole somebody finds you, you are driven across the United States and on the highway, it's like this whole production, and it's really not that. So can you clarify for me again in my head the difference between sex trafficking, this is for children, so sex trafficking and sexual abuse? Is the only thing just that a favor is involved in one and not the other, or some type of value thing is involved in one and not the other?
Yes, it's something of a value is exchanged to make it trafficking.
Okay.
Otherwise, it would be simple rape or sexual abuse.
Okay.
So in sex trafficking, you have sexual abuse, but
Yes.
not all sexual abuse is sex trafficking.
Correct.
Unless something of value is being exchanged.
Right. Whether that's food, shelter, nurture, even anything like that. It doesn't have to be a tangible.
Well, it does have to be something that has a quote value. So I'm not sure if would nurture be would extend to nurture, Ashley?
There have been cases, believe it or not, when it comes to minors, there have been cases where that has the sense of a version of nurturing, that support in exchange for. So for instance, the person said, I'm not going to give you my love or my attention or my whatever, or unless you do this for me, unless you sleep with my friend, or you
That's the
do
exploitation piece too.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And so that was the exchange in a sense. So that actually has been accepted by the courts in some cases for children, but now for adults that would be a little harder. But yes, for children it has worked.
I got those books in the chat too. I'm gonna order those. Foster parents, you can use your we would probably allow you to use community activity funds for those books if you needed them. And yeah, we do a lot of grant writing. We have people that do grant writing for us, so we can look into that, because we have a couple of books we give out, but if there are some other ones we feel are really good. But yeah, based on this, reading this, I'm oh, we've probably definitely had kids in our homes that have been a part of this, whether we know it or not. Makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we can tell that just by the fact that when they do a sting in a large city, particularly, what is the highest? What is the day that is most prevalent? Is it World Series, Ashley?
The Super Bowl.
Super Bowl. Yeah, a big trafficking a day. I guess where there's more trafficking victims that day than any other single day in the United States. But we do know that they do target not only children but adults. But anything in any market, this is a market thing. Any market that, as long as there is a demand, there's going to be a supply. So.
I'm trying to think if I had any other questions. I do have questions that are not related to the topics, but Ashley, you said you guys are a nonprofit and you come out and could we have you speak at one of our foster care team meetings for our
absolutely
staff? And those can be all day long, and I would love to make this it sounds like you have a lot of material, and I would love to have it more tailored for professionals and kind of dive into some of these things to help educate our staff, because we can help identify some of this too.
Yeah, absolutely. We have trainings for pretty much, again, going back to, we're about prevention, which means
Yes.
we're trying to reach as many individuals in our community as possible. So for instance, we're CLEAT certified. So we train law enforcement, first responders,
Nice.
emergency medical personnel, teachers. We just did, this is like our third, I guess, time to do Southwestern Behavioral Health Center. So yeah, we absolutely have training presentations for all sorts of groups, normal church groups, youth groups.
Yes.
We have a curriculum for minors as well, which we're super excited about. A bill that just got passed at the Oklahoma Capitol that's going to require human trafficking training. It's going to be required in schools for, I believe, middle school and up, which is something that we've been fighting for the last 5 years. Because again, if they are the main target, who should be knowing this, learning this information? Our young people. They need to know that they're a target and what they can do to make themselves, not as a soft target as they are right now.
And when
So
we
yeah, absolutely.
when we train in schools, the students themselves from 12 and up, it will be an hour a day for a week. And
Yes.
so, and also, I was going to ask you about somebody else you trained, Ashley. Well, I mean, all of the Lawton public schools anyway have been trained. All the administration, all the teachers, all the students have had opportunity to be trained. So,
What was I gonna say? I totally dealt with a situation when I worked in the school. It was K through 8th grade, all in one elementary school, which is just a mess to begin with. But there was a thing where some girl sent a topless photo to her boyfriend, and then became a thing. And then it was like, oh, this is child porn. Like, here we go. And they didn't even realize it. Like, no, yes, you're now distributing it because you sent it to your friend. Congratulations, this is a problem.
yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's like, they just don't get that. I appreciated you bringing, I'm going to get really graphic here for a second, folks. I'm going to say porn. But I appreciate you bringing that to the forefront and the attention of parents in general. We deal with that a lot, and people often, like, as professionals, we understand age appropriate development from a scientific standpoint and understand what often occurs and what happens and how bodies develop and feelings and all the things. And we get a lot of pushback about even 12, 13-year-olds and that. And not that it's right, but it's like, oh, and it's like, no, like, much younger this happens, and it's very common. And it's like how to approach it in a way that's like educating and safety versus like punitive bad wrong, to just bring it to the light. So it's something that can be talked about within families.
So
And
this
then,
is
like,
something that I try and connect with pornography. So let's put ourselves back in historic times. So I love history. I'm a history buff, and that's one of the reasons, part of my journey into human trafficking or anti-human trafficking was my love for history. And during the transatlantic slave trade, we look back there, it is historic slavery, and we're going through modern day slavery. And so I asked him the question. So if you were alive, just put yourself back in the 1800s. If you were alive during the 1800s and say you were an abolitionist, so you were anti-slavery, okay? And someone came to you and said, we're going to sell you cotton, okay? And they told you that there's a 70% chance that this cotton that they're going to sell you came from a plantation. 70%-ish, but you got another 30% that it's not. So it could come from free labor. So would you buy it? And most people say, no, of course not. That's the odds of that coming from a slave, all of that's going to entail the beatings, the murders, the depriving of rights. I'm not going to put my money towards that, my time. I'm not going to go into that market. Now let's jump into the modern times. We know that pornography, about 70% of pornography is produced and is containing a sex trafficked victim Every single survivor friend that I have, they have multiple hundreds of videos of themselves on pornographic sites. So when people talk about trafficking, a lot of them say, well, I'm not a part of the problem, right? I'm not buying kids. I'm not going out and buying a prostitute. It's a lot broader than that. And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Trust me, we have had a lot of really uncomfortable people in our audience before when we start talking about this. But you got to understand, human trafficking is two-pronged. They're going after, traffickers are trying to recruit the victim, but they're also trying to recruit the demand, the buyer. So if they're going to be targeting little girls to be the victim, they're going to be targeting your little boys to be the buyer, because 99% of the buyers are male. And it all is the same story. Anytime law enforcement, locally, internationally, nationally, when they catch a buyer, they bring him in, they start talking to him, and they always ask, how did this start? It always starts with pornography. And so people need to understand that when I say it's a gateway drug, people are like, of course, Ashley, you're just being whatever, puritanical or what have you. That's what happens. And we see that over and over again. So much so now where it's not just a, oh, correlation, causation, fallacy. They're actually showing directly the pathway from a little boy at 8 years old being exposed to pornography. By time he is high school age, he's acting it out, because just like any drug, because pornography, Jacquetta knows this very well. She's done a lot of research on how it, affects the brain the same way as a drug. So it becomes addictive, and your level, your need for that next high just gets higher and higher and higher. Your tolerance gets higher. Eventually what you're watching, what you're reading, what you're listening to is not going to cut it. You have to act it out. And so by the time you're graduating high school, you're doing a lot of things with sexual partners. You get to college, and what's the thing that guys start to do, right? They want to go out to the clubs or whatever. And guess who's at the clubs? Guess who owns the clubs? Guess who owns the girls on the poles? It's your trafficker. And that is the pipeline that we're seeing on the buyer side. So when we talk about pornography, it's not something that's unrelated. It's directly related to fighting the issue of human trafficking. Because ultimately, if there's no demand, there's not going to be a supply, right? And so that I will say this, though, within 5 years of fighting trafficking, it is easier for me to attack the trafficker than it is for me to attack the buyer. I've had more pushback, more scary situations, we shall say, from buyers than I have from traffickers.
I'm going to interrupt here for just a second to say goodbye. Thank you for letting me be